So White Jesus really serves as a stand-in for the God of white Christian nationalism. It's an embrace of power, it's an embrace of money, it's guns, violence, crusades, all of these things.
In this episode, we're going to have a conversation with Angela Denker. She's a journalist and Lutheran minister, and she's author of the forthcoming book, out officially March 25th, but available everywhere for pre-order, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. I had a chance to read her book last year, give it an early endorsement, and I really hope that you will check it out. It's an important book, even more so now in this moment than it was when she was writing it. We've previously had Angela on the program to talk about her earlier book, Red State Christians, so I hope you'll check out the links to that as well in the show notes. But before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind you that if you haven't done so already, you really should subscribe to Word and Way's award-winning email newsletter, A Public Witness, where we send deep dives at the intersection of faith and politics straight to your inbox. Learn more, start reading today, and subscribe at publicwitness.wordandway.org. And now here's my conversation with Angela Denker on Disciples of White Jesus.
First of all, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, good to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. And I'm excited to talk with you about your brand new book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. And so I guess we need to clear the air at the beginning. Are you saying that we have a problem with patriarchy in the United States today?
I mean, I didn't know quite when I was writing this book how much this topic would be, in the very highest halls of political power, but it has certainly, between Elon Musk and Doge and his band of young male software engineers for the most part, to, Pete Hegseth. I mean, we've certainly got a complete topic ready to go here. But you were one of my early readers, and I loved the comments you shared about it because you addressed it not only as a researcher and someone who knows what's going on, but also as a dad. And I wrote this, as all those things, and also a mom. So I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, no, it is great. I had to refresh myself because it had been several months since I read the book. And as you were just noting, right, so you were writing it, you finish it up, early in 2024, and then it just now comes out, and there's been a presidential election, and Trump's back in office. You mentioned Musk and Hegseth and others. I mean, we were already in a moment where it was obvious that there was a problem, and it was clear as you were articulating that in the book. But I mean, wow, your book is landing in a moment where unfortunately it's even more timely and necessary than it was when you were writing it.
Yeah. And here's hoping that, people do read it and it doesn't get just totally washed out by somebody writing basically the exact same book who's more famous than me. But
isn't that always the problem that happens, right? They write it less well and later, but just because they're more famous, it gets all the attention.
That's right. So hopefully people will really hate it and share it, so if you really don't like it, make sure to post about it as well.
Yeah, that's right. Any publicity is good publicity, right?
That's right.
So you already hinted at this, but I wanted to ask you about the why, because you spent a long time. I mean, we should set that up in this project as well. You're traveling the country, you're interviewing people. There was a lot of time and work to put together this project. So tell us a little bit about that backstory of why you became so interested in this story.
Yeah, it's a good backstory, and I really hate the backstories of books where people are just like, oh, it just fell into my lap. So that's not necessarily this, like you say, there's a lot of work, but also it really wasn't, the next book that I planned to write after my first book, Red State Christians. Really a similar book as far as research and looking at white Christian nationalism, looking at Trumpism and how it intertwines with conservative and really fundamentalist Christianity. I was looking at maybe doing sort of a less political book, looking at a little bit more of my own journey of sort of coming out of church growth movement pastoral work and into sort of a rejection of all the trappings of capitalist Christianity. But as I was in that process, there was a woman who works at the publisher where I published the book, Broadleaf, and she had approached me about really doing just a project for congregations. So like a very small scale project for churches specifically, looking at white men and boys and from a parenting perspective. And so I was talking with her. I remember she came over to my house and we kind of sat and discussed this idea. And I was a little bit lukewarm on it because it was originally conceived as such a small, sort of almost more of a pamphlet than a book. But then I work with an agent who's secular. She doesn't primarily do Christian publishing, but I told her about this idea and she was like, oh my gosh, I've been talking about this topic area to, people here in New York City, people in the publishing world, and people are so interested in this book. I think especially because what I found is that everybody has a story, and much like Red State Christians, there's the national sort of political scene of what we're seeing with radicalization, violence, white men and boys, masculinity that leans toward just overt brute strength and sort of suppresses the empathy and relationships that boys can have. So there's that level of interest, but then there's also like our ordinary lives, and people, will often pull me aside. And that's what was happening for her when she was talking about this book idea. People would pull her aside and tell her about their son, their nephew, teachers would tell her about kids in their classes, coaches would tell her about boys on their teams. So there's this national concern, but then there's also this personal concern for boys and young men. So it really was hitting. And then I also did a podcast with Caleb Campbell, who's writes on Christian nationalism. And he shared with me his own personal story of going from being involved with a skinhead group to becoming really into sort of this masculine Jesus, warrior Jesus type Christianity. And then where he is today, where he works against Christian nationalism. So all those things came together. And really the final piece was talking with Caleb about the book, where I ended up going back to the publisher and saying, yeah, I'm interested. I want to do this, but like, I can't do it as a pamphlet just for churches, because I think, everybody needs to read this, especially people who never go to church, especially people who aren't religious. They are interested in this topic and care about it. So luckily it became a much bigger project, and now it's about to come out, which is wild.
Yeah. Well, that's exciting. I mean, I'll put notes links in the show notes at dogma.wordandway.org to our previous conversation about Red State Christians. I hope people will check that out if they haven't already, as well as I had Caleb on to talk about his book, Disarming Leviathan. But as you were telling us a little bit about some of the trips you were taking, one of the things I was curious about, because some of the stories are very haunting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the things I said in my endorsement of the book, that it's haunting and yet hopeful. And so we'll get to the hopeful part later, but we'll start with the haunting part. So as you're traveling around and you're writing these stories and you're listening to people talk, was there one that particularly just stuck with you? What was the one that was the most impactful in your journey towards writing this book?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't pick one, but I'm going to mention just a couple, keynotes. The book is framed by story, there's data in there, there's footnotes, there's all that good stuff, but it's really framed by story and narrative. And so the overarching two narratives of the book are Caleb's, which is at the end, and there's another kind of hopeful story for another form of masculinity we see at the end. But the book begins with sort of the opposite of Caleb's story, which is the story of Dylan Roof, who was the white supremacist mass shooter from South Carolina, who went to Mother Emanuel Church, one of the most famous historical Black churches in this country, and killed 9 people after being in a Bible study with them. And so I started the book in South Carolina, in Charleston, went to the Citadel, and there's another story of a young man there who I use a pseudonym to talk about him, Connor. His story was really important too, because it showed that what happens for boys and young men if you look at Connor, if you talk to him, he looks like a Citadel kid. He's strong, he's muscular, he's white, he's blonde. But in talking with him, it was clear that there were pieces of him that did not fit into this box and weren't being addressed by just this conservative, masculine, violent identity that was being created for him. So there's Connor's story. And then as we get into Dylan's story a little bit, what was important, I think, really was not, many people have seen the story of Dylan Roof and how he was radicalized online and how he got really deep into white supremacist manifestos. But many people would look at that and assume, oh, of course, he's from South Carolina. He must have been educated in evangelicalism. And this is where I think kind of dovetails with your work. He wasn't, his family was, on his dad's side, they were longtime members and sort of stalwart parts of an ELCA Lutheran church in Columbia, South Carolina. So that intersects with me. I'm an ELCA Lutheran pastor. I was brought up in the ELCA. My grandpa was an ELCA Lutheran pastor. And I thought it was important to go back to that congregation. When you talk about haunting, I happened to be there on All Saints Sunday. Mm. And one of the people who they were remembering on that All Saints Sunday was Dylan's father, Ben Roof. So it felt very haunting in the sense that we're all intertwined and interconnected in these traditions of white supremacy, of damaging kinds of masculinity that hurt men and boys, just as they hurt all the rest of us too. And I had a really powerful conversation with the pastor at that church who'd been this family's pastor for many years, and him sorting through his own feelings of responsibility, guilt, shame, embarrassment, sadness over having been a part of this story, but also that he knew the pastor at Mother Emanuel, one of the people who was slain that day, Clementa Pinckney, had also been at that church, making ashes together for Ash Wednesday with the pastor who I spoke to. So I think it helps to frame this work, and what I'm always trying to do in my work is helping people to see themselves in it. To take a biblical example, to not take the speck out of someone else's eye before we remove the log from our own. And so wanting people to find themselves both in the stories of hope, but also in the stories of radicalization, so that we can begin to address where it is amongst us and not just seeing it as a problem out there in the ether.
That's one of the things I think is really important in your book, is that as you're looking at this radicalization, because there's a lot of people that have been talking about the radicalization of young men, but you're seeing how it's also happening in churches and with theology. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that aspect of the way that the Bible and our theology has been weaponized as part of this radicalization.
Yeah, so the book is framed by stories, and I should have mentioned too, there's some powerful stories from the rural Midwest as you get later in the book. But then immediately from those first couple of chapters, we go into theology, and we go into chapters both on God and how these masculine views of God have impacted the way that white Christian boys and men are raised and formed as their identity in this country. And then we also have a chapter on Jesus. And if you're looking at what I've really noticed, particularly since the assassination attempts this past summer on Donald Trump, you really start to see Trump sort of claiming, and the propaganda surrounding Trump claiming that messianic identity for Trump himself. And there's almost been a merging of identity and imagery between Trump himself and Jesus. So we're seeing, muscular depictions of both men. We're seeing increasingly crusader ideology and imagery. So those two chapters, the one both on God and looking how this traditionally patriarchal view of God is sort of the old white man in the sky with the long beard, and then Jesus as what I was brought up with, these popular books that were given to teenagers to help us understand our identity as young Christian girls and boys. John Eldridge's Wild at Heart is one of the preemptive examples of this, that are really looking at Jesus as an avatar of this ideal white man. And of course, Kristen Dumais in Jesus and John Wayne really lays the groundwork for some of this understanding too.
So just to make sure I'm on the same page, are you saying that God's not this white guy with a long flowing beard up in the clouds?
I mean, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But no, I think that's the key part too, is that what people don't, and what I get frustrated with if I put on my journalism lens to look at all this, people often, and media reporters often, dismiss the role of theology because they say, well, the country's not that religious anymore. People don't go to church anymore. It's really not that important. But the truth is that there's a cultural conception of who God is and who Jesus is that people really ascribe to, whether or not they're religious or not. You know, if you ask most Americans, specifically most white Americans, to describe God or describe Jesus, you're going to get a description that matches pretty strongly the one that's being put out by conservative fundamentalists, you know, evangelical sort of masculinity type people. That's the overriding cultural conception of God and Jesus in this country, which is why it has such a powerful hold. Even if people are not going to church, don't consider themselves Christian, don't consider their faith to be an important part of their lives.
I wanted to highlight that because it's obviously the title, Disciples of White Jesus, right? So that I mean, obviously this is about, you know, masculinity and patriarchy and a lot of other things, but then race is also wrapped up so much in that in your book because it's wrapped up with that in American society.
Yeah, definitely. This wasn't the original title of the book. I wasn't quite going to go there at first. And what happened is, again, as I was doing these research trips and starting to write about this topic, I really had so many people coming up and asking me, either in person or online, and saying like, oh, if you're writing about men and boys, you're writing about radicalization, are you going to talk about white Jesus? And it was this comment and question from people, again, you know, not necessarily who were pastors, who were involved with the church, but they had this cultural idea of white Jesus. And so white Jesus really serves as a stand-in for the God of white Christian nationalism. It's an embrace of power, it's an embrace of money, it's guns, violence, crusades, you know, all of these things that offer great promises to young white men and boys. We're seeing them glorified in places like the Manosphere, as well as in places like prosperity gospel congregations. But ultimately, these promises leave most young white men and boys who subscribe to them feeling empty, driftless, alone, broken relationships. I mean, we only have to look at, you know, Elon Musk and Donald Trump to see how well these ideas work out relationally in people's lives.
Yeah, so you've mentioned the violence, and that is one thing I wanted to make sure that we talked about as well, because I mean, obviously, it's really a big part of the book, but it's a serious concern. What's happening in our society with young white boys and this radicalization into glorifying and participating in violence?
Yeah, there are two sort of major statistics that weighed on my heart as I was doing this research and writing this book. And it was these two things, that mass shooters are more likely than any other population type to be white males. And at the same time, the population group that is most likely to die by suicide is also white males. And I can't remember the particular age breakdown for both of those, but it really spoke to this sense for me that this form of radicalized masculinity that is being really supported by popular Christianity in this country and dominant Republican politics is destructive and costing lives in violent mass shootings, violent imagery, and it's also causing internal violence, you know, put back on themselves for white men and boys. And you certainly see that. I saw that in my work as a pastor in rural Minnesota, with some of the economic challenges that are coming for farmers, for rural Americans, for young Americans in general. There's this hangover of despair, and it's all connected to, you know, what I keep talking about a lot too, is that part of what created this dominant narrative about men and boys in this country, the reason that it's been so dominated by the right is because there's been a vacuum on the left. You know, Democrats, progressives have been hesitant to even talk about white men and boys. And I'm sympathetic to that to a point, you know, as a woman, as a feminist who spent my life in mostly male-dominated professions in sports writing, in the ministry. But at the same time, you know, not talking at all about what's happening for men and boys has created just this vacuum that where now young white men and boys, when they go to look for information online and culture about what it means to be a man, they're being shoveled all this really destructive ideology, and there's really not a whole lot to counter it.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I think this is, you're kind of almost getting us to that point, is I wonder. I know not a lot of people have read the book yet, although we're going to fix that, right? With this podcast right here, and then hopefully all of your other media appearances as well. But I'm wondering, are you worried about the pushback, or what would you say if you get the pushback of, wait, why are we focusing on white men yet again? When they still have a privileged space compared to black men and boys, and Hispanic men and boys, and women. And so what's your answer as to why it's important that the left doesn't have a vacuum when it comes to conversations by, about, and to white men and boys?
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking this weekend at a large congregation here in Minneapolis and saying, kind of being asked a similar question, and it's a big answer in a long conversation, but part of it begins with sort of the left and the Democratic Party's misuse of identity politics, and this sense that we're going to campaign and communicate with people according to what category we put them in demographically and racially. We're going to communicate with people according to interest groups, and we're going to classify it that way. And one of the ways we're going to be anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, is we're going to take people from those groups, individuals, and put them in positions of power and platform them. And we're going to say this really shows because our leadership maybe has this identity that we're not racist, sexist, all these other things, without ever really addressing the underlying structures and systems, many of them economic and structural, that maintain racism, segregation, sexism in this country. So people are smart enough to see, hey, there's been a lot of lip service, but not a whole lot of real change or real progress. And a lot of folks, I spoke with for Red State Christians, a lot of people of color, Black Christian leaders, Hispanic Christian leaders who were put into positions at predominantly white, large congregations. And as soon as they started to say anything that didn't toe the company line, all of a sudden they're out. And they felt like, okay, I was put in this position to make it look like my church was inclusive, but really my church wasn't. So all that to say, I think it's created an environment in America, and we certainly saw this with Trump's election, of cynicism, of people thinking none of this was really real. So what the right has done to counter that, they've now, the Republican Party has now sort of become the party of identity politics. And has really embraced identity politics. And so I think the counter to that cannot continue to be identity politics, where we just say, well, we're not going to talk about white men and boys because they're not one of our interest groups. That's my political social answer. My pastoral answer, my faith answer, is that, as a follower of Jesus, I'm told over and over again throughout the Bible that every single human being is created in the image of God. I don't get to have exceptions there. I don't get to say that because somebody is a white man that they don't have a humanity that needs to be considered. And I think that's the unintended consequence of some of the messaging that has been out there culturally. And I definitely see it as a mom of boys, and I hear it from other parents of boys and young white men about the impact of maybe that unintended, but still that messaging on young white men and boys. It does feel dehumanizing, and it does, from a faith-based perspective, go against this sense of the dignity of every single human being, regardless of who they are.
Agree with that, except for you now it really feels like you're meddling, that you're telling me I have to go and still love Musk and Trump and Hegseth as image bearers of God, and Now this is, easier said than done.
I mean, I preached on Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, and so I read a portion of MLK's sermon on love, and he talks about that a little bit, and it's so good. I mean, he says it better than I ever could. But he also talks about how, love, it doesn't look like necessarily acceptance, or so I don't know. It's some really good stuff. I go to those places when I get concerns like that.
Yeah. So we promised earlier in the conversation that there is also some hope in the book.
Sure.
And I don't know if you've completely lost all of the hope from when you were writing. Everything has changed since then. But no, I mean, seriously, like, what can we do besides everyone should buy the book as a starting place? But what's something that we can do to push back against this crisis that we have?
Yeah, my hope really comes both as a pastor and a journalist and a parent, in learning how to tell new stories and embrace new narratives. So I think there's this desire to immediately go to like a legislative or a policy prescription. Okay, how do we address this problem of young white men and boys? Like, where's the money that we can throw at it? What are the training programs? And there have been a lot of other works on this topic area, from like a social political perspective. Richard Reeves wrote Of Boys and Men, and one of the things he talks about is we need to get more men into the healing professions, teaching, nursing, caring professions. I think that's great. I'm on board with that. My perspective and what I want to contribute to the conversation is not a legislative or a policy prescription. But instead, I want people to get comfortable with alternative narratives about what it looks like to be a strong man. I think strength and redefining strength is really, really important. So I'm going to tell a story because this is how I think people can relate to what they do in the midst of all this. So I'm married to a white guy, raised in the Midwest, works in a conservative field, works in a male-dominated field. And he was recently doing some, career-based personality testing. And so he's going through and he was sharing with me a little bit about it. And he gave me permission to share this. He said he's going through this and he was like, yeah, every time that they asked if I had empathy, I always put a 0, like no empathy at all. And it would come up over and over again in this testing. And I'm thinking, okay, I've known you since you were 21 years old, and I have seen a huge amount of empathy. I wouldn't have married someone who had no empathy. B, he's a father, he's a coach. I watched him just a weekend ago, like tear up when he's saying thank you to this one child on his team who came to watch the tournament, even though he was hurt. I've seen him, as he works with his younger coworkers and be there for them in the midst of death and grief. This is not a person who has no empathy. But as we sort of unpacked it, like, why are you answering 0 or 1 for empathy? He said he eventually came around to that he had received this very strong idea that to have any empathy would mean he was weak. And to be weak is the ultimate last thing that you want to be as a boy or a man raised in this country in many, many cases, and certainly in strong ways in specific swaths of America, and certainly in conservative Christian contexts. So I think I share that story just to say, oftentimes we are passing down those messages to the boys and men in our lives, even if we don't intend to. When we say, oh, don't cry, don't get hurt, or we're thinking, I find myself with my little boys, like, I wonder, would I be more sympathetic to when they get hurt if they were a little girl, or there's just these gender-based expectations that I think are really tiny changes that we can start to help boys and men view a different kind of strength. And for my husband and for men like him to see your empathy is a form of strength. It makes you a better supervisor at work. It makes you a better coach. It makes you a better father. It makes you a better husband. That is a form of strength. But we have to really get over this big hurdle of equating positive, healthy relationships with weakness, because that leads us to this generation of men who, many of them, they don't have friends. They have broken relationships. you know, and that leads us to a place of being susceptible to violence and radicalization.
So I did want to ask on a different subject, since, you know, I know that while we're talking about your new book coming out, also it's the start of March Madness. And as you already mentioned, you used to be a sports journalist. So, I mean, what's your bracket guess or pick, or who are you going for?
Oh my gosh. Well, so my youngest son is 9, and he and his friends have a bracket group, and that is like peak age for male competitiveness. So I'm mostly channeling it through my son. I'm paying attention to the high school basketball tournaments here in Minnesota. I have to be honest, I have not followed college basketball real strongly this year, but I am rooting for Mizzou. I always cheer for Missouri, and one of these years we're going to make the Final Four.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, we haven't figured this out. We were at Mizzou at the same time. I was in grad school and you were an undergraduate, but we never met during that time period. So you and I are both. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask. Give a shout out to Mizzou here. We're both rooting.
MIZ.
Let's do it. ZOU. So. Well, Angela, thanks. As always, it's great to talk with you. The book is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. It's available for pre-order wherever people buy books. I hope people will go and grab a copy now. And thanks for all the work that you've been doing.
Thanks for having me.